If you have a mortgage, a 401k, or a child born on American soil, the last 5 days at the Supreme Court affect you directly. In a single week, the nation's highest court handed down two rulings that touch the citizenship of American-born children, the independence of the institution that sets your interest rates, and the outer limits of what a president can order unilaterally. This isn't abstract legal theory playing out in marble hallways in Washington. It is the culmination of a year and a half in which President Trump used executive orders to try to reshape immigration law, the Federal Reserve, and America's trade policy, and the Supreme Court, again and again, has been the final word on whether those orders stand. Some of them didn't, some of them did. And the pattern emerging from these decisions is now reshaping how much power any president can wield with the stroke of a pen. Here is what actually happened, what is confirmed, and what it means for you. Over the past week, the Supreme Court issued two major rulings tied directly to Trump-era executive orders. On June 29th, the court ruled that Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook could remain in her job while she challenges President Trump's attempt to fire her, a decision that, for now, preserves the Fed's independence from direct presidential control. Then, on July 1st, the court ruled 6-3 that Trump's January 2025 executive order attempting to end automatic birthright citizenship for children born in the United States to parents who are undocumented or here temporarily was unconstitutional. That order, signed on Trump's very first day back in office, was struck down under the 14th Amendment. These two rulings did not arrive in isolation. They followed a February decision that already struck down the legal basis for Trump's sweeping global tariffs. Taken together, this is the clearest picture yet of where the Supreme Court is willing to draw a line around executive power and where it is not. The story really begins on January 20th, 2025, Trump's first day back in office, when he signed an executive order seeking to deny automatic citizenship to children born in the U.S. if neither parent was a citizen or permanent resident. Lower courts blocked it almost immediately. On February 1st, 2025, Trump signed a series of executive orders imposing tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, citing fentanyl trafficking. In April 2025, he expanded this into sweeping global reciprocal tariffs using the same law, citing the U.S. trade deficit as a national emergency. In August 2025, Trump attempted to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, citing allegations of mortgage fraud predating her time at the Fed. A federal judge blocked the firing days later, and the case worked its way through the courts for the next 10 months. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in Learning Resources versus Trump that the emergency powers law Trump used did not authorize him to impose tariffs at all, striking down what had been his signature trade policy. Trump responded within hours by imposing new, smaller tariffs under a different law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. On June 29, 2026, the court ruled 5-4 that Lisa Cook could remain on the Fed board while her lawsuit proceeds. And on July 1, 2026, in the case Trump versus Barbara, the court ruled 6-3 against Trump's birthright citizenship order, affirming that the 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship to nearly everyone born on U.S. soil. To understand why these rulings matter, it helps to understand what an executive order actually is. It is a directive from the president to federal agencies, and it does not require Congress's approval. That makes it a fast tool for a president to act, but also one of the most legally fragile because it can be challenged in court the moment it takes effect, and it carries none of the durability of an actual law passed by Congress. The 14th Amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction are citizens of the United States. That language has been interpreted for more than a century to extend to nearly everyone born on American soil, regardless of their parents' immigration status. Trump's order sought to reinterpret subject to the jurisdiction thereof to exclude children of undocumented or temporary immigrants, a legal theory many scholars viewed from the outset as a long shot. The Federal Reserve case touches a different but equally consequential principle. Congress created the Fed in 1913 specifically to keep interest rate decisions insulated from short-term political pressure, and it built that insulation by allowing a president to remove a Fed governor only for cause. meaning neglect of duty or actual misconduct, not policy disagreements. No president before Trump had ever tried to fire a sitting Fed board member. The tariff case, meanwhile, involved the same emergency powers law Trump used to justify duties on nearly every country trading with the United States. The Supreme Court held that this law does not give the president authority to impose tariffs at all, a ruling that invalidated both the fentanyl-related tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, and the broader reciprocal tariffs on the rest of the world. Reaction from the president has varied sharply depending on the case. On the Birthright citizenship ruling, Trump posted on social media that the decision was too bad for our country, but said Congress could pass legislation to accomplish the same goal without needing a constitutional amendment. Writing for the majority in that case, Chief Justice John Roberts said there was scant evidence for the administration's reinterpretation of how the 14th Amendment has been understood for decades, adding that citizenship, then and now, was the right to have rights. Justice Clarence Thomas dissented, writing that the amendment's protections were primarily aimed at formerly enslaved Black Americans rather than the children of temporary visitors. Justice Samuel Alito separately warned the ruling preserves an incentive for people to enter or remain in the country illegally. On the Fed case, Lisa Cook said in a statement that the fight was never about mortgage documents signed years before I became a Federal Reserve governor, calling it instead an attempt to remove her because she refused to bow to political pressure on interest rates. Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority there as well, warned that accepting the administration's argument would effectively transform the Federal Reserve's for-cause protection into at-will employment, a result he called out of step with the statute Congress passed and the nation's tradition of independent central banking. On the tariff ruling back in February, the court held that the tariffs exceeded the powers Congress gave the president under the 1977 law he relied on, and Trump notably did not concede the fight. He pivoted within hours to a different statute. The Supreme Court struck down Trump's Birthright citizenship executive order by a 6-3 vote on July 1, 2026. The court allowed Fed Governor Lisa Cook to remain in her position while litigation continues, by a 5-4 vote on June 29, 2026. The court struck down Trump's global tariffs imposed under the Emergency Powers Law by a 6-3 vote on February 20, 2026, and Trump replaced them within hours with new tariffs under a separate statute. Those invalidated tariffs had already raised more than $160 billion for the federal government before the ruling. In a related case, the court separately expanded presidential authority by upholding Trump's firing of Federal Trade Commission Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter, showing the court's approach is not uniformly restrictive of executive power. It depends heavily on the specific agency and legal question involved. Whether Trump can ultimately succeed in firing Cook once her case is fully litigated in the lower courts. Whether Congress will act on Trump's call to legislate restrictions on birthright citizenship, an effort several Republican allies say would still require a constitutional amendment, and whether the replacement tariffs Trump imposed under Section 122 of the Trade Act, which are capped and time-limited, will be extended by Congress before they expire. Legal analysts describe this string of rulings as revealing a Supreme Court willing to check the president on specific, narrow legal grounds while simultaneously expanding his authority elsewhere. According to NPR's reporting on the pattern, the court has affirmed the president's broad authority to fire commissioners at federal agencies designed by Congress to be independent, which experts across the political spectrum describe as a significant concentration of power in the presidency, even as the court drew a firmer line specifically around the Federal Reserve and around birthright citizenship. Economists have pointed to the tangible cost of the tariff episode regardless of the ultimate ruling. Analysis from the Tax Foundation found that tariffs added roughly $1,000 to average household costs in 2025 and as much as $1,300 in 2026. And researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that nearly 90% of tariff costs were ultimately borne by American businesses and consumers rather than foreign exporters. On the Fed case specifically, commentators have noted the near-unanimous alarm among economists of both parties. Virtually every living current or former Federal Reserve chair, along with former Treasury secretaries from both parties, signed a legal brief urging the court not to tamper with the Fed's independence, reflecting concern that political control over interest rate decisions could destabilize the broader economy. For American families, the birthright citizenship ruling means the status quo holds. A child born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen, regardless of the parent's immigration status, unless Congress changes the law, a heavy political lift that would likely require overcoming a Senate filibuster or amending the Constitution outright. For anyone with a mortgage, a savings account, or investments tied to interest rates, the Fed ruling matters enormously. Keeping Lisa Cook in her seat, at least for now, preserves the Fed's traditional independence from White House pressure on rate decisions, something economists broadly view as essential to keeping inflation and borrowing costs predictable. For businesses and consumers, the tariff saga has meant months of shifting costs and uncertainty. Even after the Supreme Court struck down the broadest tariffs, Trump moved within hours to impose new tariffs under different legal authority, keeping a version of his trade policy alive, which means the higher cost environment for many imported goods has largely persisted even as the legal justification changed. Globally, allies and trading partners have watched closely. European Union officials have described Washington's trade policy as chaotic, and some trade agreements have been paused as a result of the shifting legal landscape. Several things remain genuinely uncertain. Trump has urged Congress to pass legislation restricting birthright citizenship, but that faces steep constitutional hurdles and would almost certainly trigger new litigation even if passed. The Lisa Cook case returns to lower courts, where a full trial on whether her firing met the legal standard of for cause could take months or longer, and her case could eventually return to the Supreme Court for a final ruling on the merits. And the replacement tariffs Trump imposed after the February ruling are time-limited. Unless Congress votes to extend them, they are set to expire, which would force another decision point on trade policy later this summer. The Supreme Court has now ruled on 3 separate executive actions tied to President Trump's use of executive orders: striking down his birthright citizenship order, keeping Fed Governor Lisa Cook in place for now, and invalidating his global emergency tariffs earlier this year. In each case, the court applied real legal limits to specific presidential actions, while in a separate ruling this year, it also expanded presidential removal power over other independent agencies. What remains uncertain is how Congress will respond on citizenship, how the Cook litigation will ultimately resolve, and what trade policy will look like once the current replacement tariffs expire. What's clear is that this has been one of the most consequential stretches for presidential power in modern Supreme Court history, and the decisions still working their way through the courts will keep shaping immigration policy, the cost of borrowing, and the price of the goods Americans buy every day. We'll continue following each of these cases as they develop.